Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen Bennett, LLG's Executive Director of Policy and Governance, and Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hello, everyone.
Now then, the front cover of the MJ last week told us that uneven progress in devolution across England could result in council resistance to government plans to drive housing growth via development corporations. Actually, LGR dominates the edition, no surprise there, but for more planning and development news, head over to the LLG vlog this week where Dennis and I will be giving you the lowdown. But let's turn our attention to the business of the bulletin, and you will all have seen the outcome of the Mazur appeal. So Dennis, let's wrap that up neatly for our listeners, but also have a little think about what LLG might do moving forward.
Well, indeed, Helen, we really must cover the Mazur case. It was controversial, and indeed, there are still some controversies that remain. But commentators got this one wrong. Common sense, in the end, prevailed. So we'll focus here on the decision and what precisely the court said about the issue of delegation and the conduct of litigation. As if you needed a reminder, the Court of Appeal has overturned Mr. Justice Sheldon's judgment in Mazur, holding that unauthorised staff may conduct litigation under proper supervision.
I tell you, it wasn't just commentators that got it wrong. I got it wrong.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, me too.
Although in a way we didn't, because actually it's not like the situation has turned into a free for all. But we'll come on to that. So yes, in Silex and others, Mazur and others, Sir Geoffrey Voss, it was Master of the Rolls, Sir Colin Burse, who's the Chancellor of the High Court, and Lady Justice Andrews allowed Silex appeal, finding that, and I'm going to quote them, it is not unlawful for an unauthorised person to act for and on behalf of an authorised individual so as to conduct litigation under their supervision, provided the authorised individual puts in place appropriate arrangements for the supervision of and delegation to the unauthorised person.
The professional body for Silex lawyers, chartered legal executives, paralegals and other legal professionals launched its appeal bid last year over serious concerns about the impact of Mr. Justice Sheldon's judgment on law firms, lawyers and the public. Justice Sheldon ruled that an employee of an authorised firm cannot conduct litigation simply by virtue of their employment, even if supervised by an authorised person. And his decision raised questions over the use of legal executives in the conduct of litigation, and has led to a series of practice notes and guidance being published by legal bodies including the Law Society and Silex Regulation.
Yeah, that's right. And handing down judgment in the Court of Appeal, and it was Tuesday the 31st of March when it broke, the Chancellor of the High Court said the result of this case means that the role of an unauthorised person in the context of the conduct of litigation is not limited merely to assisting or supporting an authorised individual, and the distinction drawn in the court below by the Law Society and SRA, that's in respect of their submissions, and adopted by the judge between A, supporting or assisting, and B, conducting litigation under supervision was not correct.
And going on, the judgment said it is not unlawful for an unauthorised person to act for and on behalf of an authorised individual so as to conduct litigation under their supervision, provided the authorised individual puts in place appropriate arrangements for the supervision of and delegation to the unauthorised person.
Well, elsewhere, he identified that some tasks which are clearly within the conduct of litigation and some tasks that are clearly outside the conduct of litigation. He added, despite, however, the obvious desirability of clarity, I have concluded, he said, that it is simply not possible to provide a comprehensive list of all those tasks that fall within and outside the conduct of litigation. And that has to be right, I think.
Yeah, setting out his conclusions on the proper meaning of carrying on the conduct of litigation, he said, there's always been a widespread and well-regulated practice of delegation by solicitors to unqualified individuals. The words conduct of litigation refer to the tasks to be undertaken, whilst the words carry on refer to direction and control of and responsibility for those tasks.
I think that's helpful, actually. The judges also decided, however, the question of whether an offence under Section 14 of the Legal Services Act 2007 is committed is one of fact and degree and depends on whether the unauthorised person is taking responsibility for the tasks that amount to the conduct of litigation, or whether the tasks are simply mechanical or administrative.
An unauthorised person may lawfully perform any tasks which are within the scope of the conduct of litigation for and on behalf of an authorised individual, such as a solicitor or appropriately authorised SILEX member, provided the authorised individual retains responsibility for the tasks delegated to the unauthorised person, both formal responsibility and the responsibilities identified in Section 1, subsection 3 of the 2007 Act. In that situation, the authorised individual is the person carrying on the conduct of litigation. That's the key point.
Absolutely. And the delegation of tasks by the authorised individual to the unauthorised person requires proper direction, management, supervision and control, the details of which are matters for the regulators. The authorised individual must put in place appropriate arrangements. The degree of appropriate control and supervision will always depend on the circumstances. So, whilst LLG digest this and determine, what guidance we could usefully produce, and we'll wait for the regulators' guidance. And there might be some lobbying potential as well, specific to local government. I think it's time to hold another meeting of the Mazur group to really thrash out what exactly the challenges are. Because, of course, as we've said, what the Court of Appeal doesn't do is say everyone can do what they like. There must still be effective supervision unless authorised. And if you're interested in coming along to a roundtable and you haven't previously been on the Mazur roundtables, please do get in touch and we'll make sure you're on the list. Now let's move on. Something a bit cultural, literally, because the government has announced it will accept or explore all recommendations made last year by Baroness Hodge in her independent review of Arts Council England, including to create a statutory duty, that's a statutory duty for local government, to prepare a cultural strategy every 5 years.
In her independent review, Baroness Hodge said, "We encountered dismay across the country at the cuts to local authority funding for the arts. Our vision for the arts," she said, "is clear. Under this government, access to exceptional culture will no longer be the preserve of the few, and citizens will be able to enjoy a cultural offer that is bold, representative, and genuinely unafraid of challenging the status quo."
Yeah, well, at the heart of the recommendations is a clear reaffirmation of the role arts and culture play in a healthy democracy, and a strong independent arts council protected by the arm's length principle is presented not as an administrative detail, but in fact as a democratic safeguard. By keeping individual funding decisions free from political interference, artists and organisations across England can create, challenge and experiment with confidence. And for citizens, this means a cultural landscape that reflects a genuine diversity of ideas and experiences rather than shifting political priorities.
And alongside this democratic foundation sits a strong economic and civic argument. The commitment of £1.5 billion in capital funding over the course of this Parliament recognises the reality of financial fragility across the sector. Investment in refurbishing theatres, concert halls, museums and libraries is not just about buildings. It is about giving communities the infrastructure to gather, create and participate. Coupled with tax reliefs, new financial tools and support for touring, the recommendations point towards a more resilient ecosystem, one that can take creative risks while remaining rooted in local places.
Well, a particularly significant shift is the emphasis on citizens and communities shaping cultural decisions. So, culture priority places, what's called hyper-local engagement and stronger regional decision making, and that ties into LGR, are designed to ensure that public funding reflects what matters to people where they live.
And this is not framed as lowering standards, but as widening access to excellence, bringing more art form experts into decision making while reducing bureaucracy for organisations. This aims to balance artistic quality with genuine local relevance.
Yeah, and the future of talent is another central thread in this. The proposals to support individual artists through a new national programme, alongside reforms to arts education and enrichment, acknowledge that cultural sustainability depends on people, not just institutions. So, expanding access to high quality arts education, particularly for children and young people in economically I'm struggling with the word here, economically challenged areas is positioned as a long-term investment rather than a luxury, which I think it is actually at the moment.
You're right. And finally, the recommendations recognise that the Arts Council itself must itself evolve. Better systems, smarter use of data, and a clearer role as an advocate and development agency are intended to free up time and energy, shifting focus away from process and towards people. Taken together, these proposals outline a vision of culture that is independent, deeply rooted in communities, and essential to both democratic life and future growth.
Well, on timings, the government has said it wants citizens to be experiencing some of the changes that it's pursuing within 2026. That seems ambitious. And certainly by the end of the Parliament, government have said they want to see significant reforms to the Arts Council embedded and working smoothly, but it acknowledged that comprehensive and wide-ranging nature of the review means that they will necessarily need to make decisions on which areas to prioritise. So interesting. Now, in other news, and a topic I think must be confusing for the majority of the public, just simply by its title, spatial strategies, Dennis.
Exactly, Helen. I think I agree with your description there, but our members in particular need to understand this because the government's new spatial strategies are a key driver of change in our sector and wider than that. But the LGA is expressing concerns that local authorities must have a real role in their development and operation. So let's see what the LGA has said exactly on this. Well, the LGA has said it is key that that in the drive to achieve universal coverage of spatial development strategies, or SDSs, across England, local authorities and communities should have a meaningful voice and role within regional approaches to their development.
Yeah, well, responding to a government consultation on the plans, the LGA said it is vital that these strategies are led at local or locally agreed appropriate level. The consultation, which closed, it was Thursday, the 26th of March, called for views on the potential geographies of the proposed SDS, with the government backing plans to align the strategies with mayoral strategic authority areas.
Yes, and it said the SDSs themselves will help ensure that sub-regional areas can effectively plan to meet their housing needs, coordinate the provision of strategic infrastructure, grow their economies, and improve the environment and climate resilience. In its submission, the LGA said it welcomes the commitment to achieve universal coverage of the strategies to tackle genuinely cross-boundary challenges like housing and infrastructure.
Yeah, but it did say, however, that it should be, sorry, the LGA said it should be ensured that all constituent local authorities and local communities have a meaningful voice and role within regional approaches to spatial planning. And going on, the LGA said that local authorities should always be given the flexibility to influence the geography that is most appropriate for local needs, as opposed to a central directive.
And the LGA has also said that the success of SDSs is dependent on constituent councils and communities being heard and represented throughout the preparation of the plan. And it added, not permitting a seat at the table or a voting role for planning authorities on SDSs could have significant implications on a strategic area's ability to meet housing needs, as local knowledge and evidence may be overlooked. Appropriate consideration should therefore be made to proportionality and agreed at a local level. And it went on to say that it recommends the government take a coordinated approach to any boundary changes across public services, ensuring where possible that devolution to planning, the NHS, the police and fire services and probation services enable alignment with regional authorities well placed to collaborate with one another.
Yeah, and commenting overall, the LGA's response said that the LGA urges the government to consider the significant period of change and uncertainty for local planning authorities with devolution, widespread local government reorganisation, the introduction of SDS, and changes to plan making. And it added it's essential that councils with their local knowledge and expertise have a key role in shaping the geographies that are right for them in preparing spatial development strategies. I think I've already stressed that point.
Yeah, that's right. And finally, going on, the LGA said ensuring councils and communities are heard and represented. This is their key message. Throughout the process will be critical to meeting housing need and delivering the government's ambitions. The LGA calls on the government to take a coordinated approach to boundary changes, as we've said, to safeguard effective and balanced decision making and ensure that the role and expertise of local authorities are fully engaged. Now, in putting this piece together, Helen, a question did occur to me. Do our members get involved in policy matters? Do they come across their desks? Because the formulation of procedures for policy formulation and the rules around drafting policies, the legal rules, are complex and they are matters of law. They are legal issues. And I wonder whether our members are asked to advise at the policy development stage. There are many rules and regulations, as I say, that cover these things. Let us know to what extent you yourself are involved. And you know where to do that on the forum page on our LLG website.
Absolutely. Now, let's turn our attention to the part of the employment rights proposals, and here we're sticking with the LGA. This is the LGA's response to the government's consultation on whether and how the Employment Rights Act 2025 restrictions on the use of fire and rehire to change terms and conditions should apply to changes to expenses and benefits in kind and shift patterns. So I think it's important to make clear here that the LGA's response reflects a firmly cross-party view on the issues raised in the consultation, and it advises that council's perspectives merit careful consideration, given the scale of the workforce affected and the essential public services delivered.
The LGA made clear that councils operate within a mature and well-established industrial relations framework. Employment terms and conditions are typically agreed collectively with recognised trade unions through extensive consultation mechanisms and, where necessary, ACAS-supported processes.
Within this context, the use of fire and rehire, and we know this, they describe it as exceptionally rare in local government and only ever contemplated as a last resort. And where it has arisen, it has usually been driven by compelling factors such as addressing equal pay risks, implementing new pay and grading structures, responding to externally imposed service changes, or managing large-scale, here we go, local government reorganisation.
And importantly, the LGA highlighted that councils take seriously the legal and industrial risks associated with bypassing recognised unions, particularly under the legal provision is Section 145B of the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act 1992. As a result, councils make sustained efforts to reach agreement through collective bargaining, and they approach any alternative routes with significant caution.
The LGA has warned of unintended consequences arising from an extensive ban on fire and rehire without a viable alternative mechanism for achieving contractual change. So the concern expressed is that removing this option entirely could discourage meaningful negotiation, entrench outdated working practices, or allow one union to block changes supported by the majority of the workforce. So the LGA is advising that sufficient employer flexibility must be retained to support service sustainability and organisational change.
On specific policy areas, the LGA indicated that councils are likely to favour options that exclude expenses, benefits and payments in kind from restricted contractual variations. Councils do not typically seek to change such provisions unreasonably, as they are usually linked to operational necessity or recruitment and retention issues. Similarly, councils are expected to support full flexibility around shift pattern changes, which are often essential to respond to evolving service delivery demands, including changes between day and night or weekday and weekend working.
Yeah, overall, the LGA's position is that reform should balance employee protections with the operational realities facing local government, ensuring councils retain the tools necessary to deliver vital public services effectively. Now, whilst we're on consultation responses, Dennis, let's look at something. I'm not sure where I sit on this yet, but it concerns what ministers are calling consultation culture.
Yes, I'm slightly skeptical until I know what this looks like. It depends on how it develops, I think. But ministers have announced and they've said they want to end what they called Whitehall's consultation culture and speed up decision making by scrapping a range of requirements. Depends which ones, of course. Minister for the Cabinet Office, Nick Thomas Simons, said the government would use artificial intelligence, be careful there, to identify existing disproportionate reporting and consultation duties that are slowing down delivery. There would be changes to ensure, he said, equality impact assessments, improve policy and results, while environmental impact assessments would be replaced by environmental outcomes reports, which the minister described as part of a significant step in reducing bureaucracy around new infrastructure projects. Both would be used only proportionately, he said.
Hmm. Well, other changes will include reform of the process for collective cabinet agreement of government policy and a new accountability framework for civil service permanent secretaries, which are designed to focus on delivering the Prime Minister's priorities and holding people to account for doing so. In what way, I'm not sure. Thomas Simmons said for too long, the levels of power in Whitehall have been trapped under layers of outdated regulations and overlapping consultations that prioritise process over progress.
Everything depends on what it is they're talking about here. And I think the minister has been very careful, hasn't he, to
Yeah.
dodge round what particular provisions he's got in mind. Clearly, the government is anxious with avoiding delays with infrastructure projects, but I wonder what else they've got in their sights.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? And I was just going to say that. I mean, the point about a consultation for consultation's sake, which has no
Hmm.
effective engagement, obviously is not worth the paper it's written on. But consultations do play a really important part in the formation of policy and, in fact, law.
Yeah, indeed. And going on, Thomas Simon said, we're stripping away these layers to empower brilliant public servants to deliver change for working people, replacing an outsourcing of responsibility with accountability and decisive action. And the Attorney General came in on this, Lord Hermer KC. He said well-intentioned processes had slowed government decision-making down and, quote, ministers and civil servants have regularly identified excessive processes and checks as clogging up the system, creating distance between decision makers and implementation of policy, and delaying change for working people across the UK.
Well, the Cabinet Office has said that consultations, where necessary and helpful, where policy impacts a wide range of complex groups, um, but nevertheless, they had been used increasingly for routine, what they classify as routine changes. And it said, for example, that an unnamed government department consulted on a change to how it produces its annual report. And a survey had found 131 consultation requirements in just 10 pieces of legislation.
Mm. Well, ministers will consider plans, they say, to further streamline the onerous interdepartmental letter exchanges in the policy-making processes that delay and reinforce the government in silos. Simon Angelides, chief executive of the Consultation Institute, said on LinkedIn, what ministers are actually targeting is consultation requirements that have accumulated in legislation without sufficient justification, and internal Whitehall processes that have grown disproportionate to the decisions that they serve.
Well, he also said that the exception for continued consultation where policy affects complex groups was a significant carve out, his words, which covers most of what NHS bodies, local authorities, and infrastructure bodies do every week.
And he said the word disproportionate and how it was defined and by whom will determine whether there is a sensible rationalisation or something with wider consequences for statutory accountability.
I
Not
think
sure
it
what all of that
depends.
means.
No, and I think it really depends on. Uh, as you said, what the issue at hand, but we're seeing an uplift in secondary legislation, which as we all know doesn't receive the same scrutiny as a principal act, with the delegations for decisions given mostly to Secretary of States. So hand in hand with consultation removal, I don't know. Like you said, Dennis, we'll just have to see what this actually means in practice. But I always find statistics a little bit unnerving, because it would be good to know what those 131 consultation requirements in just 10 pieces of legislation. Well,
Yeah.
what was that legislation? Could be really, really important stuff.
And no doubt the
Couldn't it?
legislation was originally put forward by ministers just like Mr. Simons. So,
yeah. Well, finally, our last item of the podcast always comes around quickly. This is the report entitled Systemic Faults in London's Social Housing Allocation System. So we're on to policy still. Key findings from the Housing Committee of the London Assembly. Now, I should say that whilst this relates exclusively to London, because that's where the report was generated, there will be a lot of takeaways here for many, many cities in terms of social housing. So I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that London's social housing system is operating under intense pressure, with demand far outstripping supply. It's not the only region. While the chronic shortage of homes remains the fundamental challenge, the London Assembly Housing Committee's 2026 report identifies what it says are significant faults within the allocation system itself that compound hardship for applicants and undermine fairness, transparency, and trust.
a central finding is that the allocation process is frequently inaccessible and inequitable. Applicants face complex, opaque systems that are difficult to navigate, particularly for deaf and disabled Londoners, people with limited digital access, or those for whom English is not a first language. Medical assessments for disabled applicants and families with neurodivergent children were repeatedly described as slow, bureaucratic, and lacking compassion, creating additional distress for households already in urgent need.
Yeah, the committee also identified disqualification policies as a key structural fault. Financial eligibility criteria, including affordability testing and rent in advance requirements, can, it said, indirectly exclude households on low incomes despite their acute housing need.
The evidence also indicates that survivors of domestic abuse are disproportionately affected, particularly where debt resulting from abuse is treated as a basis for exclusion rather than vulnerability. And these practices raise serious concerns about indirect discrimination and inconsistent application of statutory guidance.
Well, a further systemic weakness identified in the report lies in the lack of transparency and consistency across boroughs. Applicants frequently reported being unable to understand their position on housing registers or how bidding decisions were made.
And this is compounded by poor quality data on allocations. Through freedom of information requests, the committee found that information on waiting times and disqualification outcomes was incomplete, inconsistent, and often not broken down by protected characteristics. This severely limits the ability of boroughs to undertake robust equality impact assessments.
Yeah, the report also highlights coordination failures between councils and housing associations. Despite housing associations' role in supporting councils' homelessness duties, nominations are sometimes rejected late in the process. The report found that this led to distressing situations where applicants are told to expect a home only to have it withdrawn. Inconsistent allocation practices between organisations result, it said, in fragmented accountability and poorer applicant experiences.
Finally, the committee identified low inter-tenure mobility as a structural obstacle. Limited movement within the social housing sector reduces churn and exacerbates pressure on waiting lists. Existing mayoral mobility schemes have insufficient scale to address this challenge meaningfully, further constraining access for those in acute need.
Yeah, and taken together, I think the findings point to a system in which operational design, policy discretion, and what the report highlights as an even implementation create avoidable barriers. Addressing supply obviously remains critical, but without reform to allocation processes, the committee found that inequalities within the system will persist. And on that note, that's it for another edition of the podcast. You can read more on the items discussed today and many more besides by going to bulletin number 14, available on the LRG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too. Bye-bye now.